Somewhere in the ruins beneath modern Turkey, in a layer of ash and collapsed stone dated to the late 13th century BC, archaeologists found a city that had been burned to the ground, not once, several times. The textbooks will tell you Homer made it up, that the Trojan War was a literary invention, a myth dressed in the language of history, and that anyone who looked for a real Troy was a romantic fool. For most of the 20th century, that was the safe academic position. Then, ancient DNA was extracted from the bones of people who actually lived in Bronze Age Anatolia, from burials in early Rome, from the graves of strangers who appeared on the coast of the Levant in the 12th century BC and never left. Almost everything comfortable about that position collapsed. The war was real, the city was real, and the people who lost, the refugees who, according to every account that survived the ancient world, sailed west, left a detectable genetic trace in the population that would eventually build the greatest empire in history. The story everyone knows, Homer's Iliad, composed in the 8th century BC but drawing on oral traditions centuries older, describes a 10-year war between a Greek coalition and the city of Troy called Ilion on the northwest coast of what is now Turkey. A prince named Paris takes a Spartan queen. 1,000 ships sail. Heroes die in the dust. The city burns. The Aeneid, Virgil's epic written for Augustus Caesar in the 1st century BC, picks up exactly where Homer ends. A Trojan prince named Aeneas, son of Anchises and the goddess Venus, escapes the burning city, carrying his aged father on his back. He sails west. After years of wandering, he lands in Latium, the region of central Italy that would become Rome. His descendants, the story says, would found the eternal city. The Romans believed themselves literally descended from the survivors of Troy. Why scholars dismissed it? For most of the 19th century, both the war and the city were treated as fiction. There was no physical evidence, no location for Troy, no independent corroboration of the Greek account. The Iliad was categorized as heroic poetry, not history. Then, in 1868, a German businessman and amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann arrived on a hill in northwest Turkey called Hisarlik. He had believed the Iliad since childhood. He dug into the hill and found not one city but 9, stacked on top of each other in successive layers of construction, destruction, and rebuilding spanning more than 3,000 years. One of those layers, Troy VI in Veda, dated to roughly 1,300–1,180 BC, showed the physical signatures of violent destruction: burned buildings, collapsed walls, arrowheads, and human skeletal remains in the rubble. The timeline matched the traditional dating of the Trojan War almost exactly, but Schliemann was also a romantic who destroyed as much as he found, and the academic establishment, burned by his methods, spent most of the 20th century treating his discovery with suspicion. The consensus hardened into a careful hedge. Hisarlik is probably the site of a real city, probably called Wilusa, which appears in Hittite records, and there may have been a real conflict. But the war, as Homer described it, the heroes, the gods, the founding of Rome from Trojan refugees, that's poetry. The Aeneas story in particular was treated as obvious political mythology, a piece of Augustan propaganda designed to give Rome a noble pedigree by connecting it to the most famous event in Greek literature: invented ancestry, a founding story for an empire that needed one. That was where the evidence sat for most of the 20th century. A real city, a plausible conflict, a legendary overlay that couldn't be tested. Then the testing began. The Hittite smoking gun. Before the DNA, the textual case had already strengthened in ways popular history hadn't caught up with. Hittite cuneiform tablets, discovered and translated through the 20th century, repeatedly reference a city called Wilusa on the northwest coast of Anatolia, in exactly the location of Hisarlik. One tablet records a treaty between the Hittite king and a king of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name linguists identify as the Anatolian form of Alexandros, which is what Homer calls Paris throughout the Iliad, not a generic king. The specific name Homer gives to the specific prince who started the war, in a Hittite administrative document from roughly the right period. This is not a coincidence that scholars are comfortable dismissing anymore. The Bronze Age collapse and who was moving. Around 1200 BC, within roughly 50 years, almost every significant civilization in the eastern Mediterranean stopped functioning. The Hittite Empire, which had contested Egypt for 2 centuries, collapsed so completely that its capital Hattusa was abandoned and burned, and its very existence was unknown to modern scholarship until the late 19th century. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece collapsed in a wave of destruction that ended its writing system and inaugurated the Greek Dark Ages. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the Levant, was burned and never reoccupied. Egyptian records from this period describe a confederacy of raiders they call the Sea Peoples Groups, arriving by ship, destroying cities, pressing south toward Egypt. Ramesses III recorded defeating them in massive reliefs on his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, listing their component groups: the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Shurden, the Jeker, the Denyen. The Sea Peoples were a group of tribes hypothesized to have attacked Egypt and other eastern Mediterranean regions around 1200 BC during the Late Bronze Age. While initial versions of the hypothesis regarded them as a primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse, more recent versions generally regard them as a symptom of events which were already in motion. The question that haunted this period for 200 years: who were they? Where did they come from? Why does Egyptian art depict them wearing feathered headdresses that look Aegean? Why does their pottery, found at sites where they settled, look like it came directly out of Mycenaean Greece? The Philistine DNA breakthrough. The Peliset, one of the named Sea Peoples groups, settled on the coast of Canaan and became the Philistines of the Bible. For decades, the physical evidence at their cities had looked distinctly Aegean. Architecture, pottery styles, the use of an Aegean script, even the consumption of pork, unusual for the region. But physical similarities are suggestive, not conclusive. In 2019, a team from the Max Planck Institute published the first genome-wide ancient DNA study of individuals buried at Ashkelon, one of the core Philistine cities. DNA from 4 infants buried beneath the earthen floors of homes in Ashkelon, dating to when Philistine culture first appears, showed they had inherited 25% to 70% of their DNA from Southern European ancestors, with the closest matches to ancient people from the Aegean, Sardinia, and Iberia. The early Iron Age population was genetically distinct due to a European-related admixture. This genetic signal is no longer detectable in the later Iron Age population, meaning the migrants arrived, mixed with local people within a few generations, and were absorbed. This is precisely what a refugee migration looks like in the genetic record. A wave of people from the Aegean, probably including Mycenaean Greeks, possibly including Trojans, and other displaced populations from the Bronze Age collapse, arriving in the Levant around 1200 BC, settling, intermarrying, and eventually losing their distinct genetic signature as they blended into the local population. The DNA data suggest a kernel of truth to Greek and Middle Eastern legends that describe survivors who moved south after the catastrophic collapse of great Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. The Aegean DNA study, who the Trojans actually were, a landmark 2023 study in Nature Ecology and Evolution, generated genome-wide data from 102 ancient individuals across Crete, the Greek mainland, and the Aegean islands spanning the Neolithic to the Iron Age. The end of the Neolithic and the following early Bronze Age were marked by Eastern gene flow, predominantly of Anatolian origin, with biological and cultural connectedness within the Aegean, supported by findings of consanguineous endogamy practiced at high frequencies, unprecedented in the global ancient DNA record. What this means for Troy. The Bronze Age Aegean was a genetically interconnected world. The people of Hisarlik were genetically close to Mycenaean Greeks. The Trojans and the Greeks, in a real and measurable sense, were cousins. The war Homer describes was not a clash between foreign civilizations. It was a family feud at civilizational scale, which is exactly what the Iliad actually says, if you read it closely. The Trojans and the Greeks share gods. They speak the same language. They observe the same rituals. They mourn each other's dead. The Rome connection, the part that was supposed to be myth, the Aeneas legend, was always the claim too far. Scholars could accept a real city at Hisarlik. They could accept a real conflict. But a Trojan prince sailing west and founding the lineage that became Rome, that was Augustan propaganda. It had to be. Except, a major 2019 study found that 11 individuals spanning several centuries of Iron Age Rome displayed a notable influx of what is called Iranian Neolithic DNA. 2 of the 11 individuals were described by scientists as a mixture of the native Italic population and a foreign population, the foreign one being either Bronze Age Armenian or Iron Age Anatolian. The fact there was an influx of Anatolian settlers in Rome in the Iron Age has recently been demonstrated by genetic studies. In central Italy, including around Rome itself, The incoming ancestry detected mainly originated from the Near East, rather than other areas of the empire. The genetic replacement of approximately 50% of the preceding Etruscan-related gene pool was likely influenced by the movement of slaves and possibly soldiers, along with a larger pattern of human mobility from the eastern Mediterranean toward Italy. The Etruscans, who immediately preceded and profoundly shaped Roman civilization, giving Rome its religious rituals, its engineering, its gladiatorial traditions, turn out, genetically, to be closely related to the Latins of Rome itself. The Etruscans shared the genetic profile of the Latins living in nearby Rome, with a large proportion of their genetic profiles coming from steppe-related ancestry, showing no evidence of a recent population movement from Anatolia. Here is where it gets genuinely interesting and genuinely contested. The genetic signal is not a straight line from Troy to Rome. It is messier and more human than that. What it shows is a detectable influx of Eastern Mediterranean, specifically Anatolian-adjacent ancestry entering the Italian peninsula during the Iron Age, in the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. Not a single founder event, not Aeneas carrying his father through the burning gates, but a real, detectable movement of people from the Eastern Mediterranean into Italy, concentrated in the period when the legend says it happened. The Romans were not lying about their ancestry. They were remembering something real imperfectly, mythologized beyond recognition, dressed in divine genealogies and heroic names. But the genetic substrate of the story was there. Return to Hisarlik. The city burns again, probably for the last time, sometime around 1180 BC, in the same wave of destruction that is ending civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean. The people who survive do not vanish. Refugees do not vanish. They move. Some of them move east, into the Anatolian interior, where later Phrygian and Lydian cultures will absorb populations displaced by the collapse. Some move south, along the Levantine coast, where Egyptian records will call them sea peoples, and their descendants will be called Philistines. Some, in numbers we cannot count, and by routes we cannot trace, move west. The DNA cannot tell us their names. It cannot confirm a man named Aeneas. What it can show is that people from the Anatolian Aegean world were present in Italy in the Iron Age, in numbers that left a genetic signal detectable 3,000 years later. The Romans who told the story of Aeneas were not inventing a connection to Troy. They were preserving, in mythological form, a demographic memory that their own bones could have confirmed. The real surprise? The surprise is not that the Trojan War happened. The archaeological and textual evidence for a real conflict at a real city called Wilusa has been building for decades. The surprise is what it means that the losers survived. Every version of the story assumes Troy's destruction was total. The city burned, the men killed, the women enslaved, the name erased, and the city was destroyed. But the people were not erased. The refugees who left that burning city, or cities like it, moved through the Bronze Age collapse like seeds, through a fire scattered, displaced, eventually taking root in new soil. The civilization that descended from those refugees, if the genetic and historical evidence is pointing where it appears to point, was not a footnote to Greek history. It was Rome. The losers of the most famous war in Western literary memory went on to build the most powerful state the Western world had ever seen. And if you want to know what happened to the winners, the Mycenaean Greeks who sacked Troy, their palaces were destroyed within a generation of the war's end. Their writing system was lost. Their kings disappeared. Their civilization vanished into 4 centuries of darkness. The people who were supposed to have lost everything built an empire. The people who won went dark. DNA just proved the Trojan War was real and the losers became Rome. The war happened. The city burned. The refugees sailed west. The rest you're living in.